I don't know what made me choose that town, but I was drawn to it, like a moth to a dimly flickering light. Maybe it was the way it called to me in the stillness of the night. Or maybe it was the job I had been assigned, something to keep me busy for a while. So I found myself in Hollow Ridge, a small, unremarkable place in the backwoods of nowhere. It had the air of a town forgotten by time. Old houses sagging at the seams, streets that curved like forgotten thoughts, and a sense of something heavier in the air. I'd been sent to oversee a minor renovation project at St. Raphael's, a church tucked between two towering oaks, their gnarled limbs reaching toward each other like old friends. It had a beauty to it, yes, but one that seemed to settle into the bones with a certain heaviness. The church had stood there for decades, its stone walls grayed by the hands of time, its roof lined with moss, but there was a garden behind it, wild, overrun, and left to rot. I was told to clear it out, to give it a fresh start. But there was something about that place, something that made me hesitate before stepping into its tangled thorns. The garden, or what was left of it, was behind a high iron gate, rusted and half buried beneath a creeping mantle of ivy. It creaked in protest as I pushed it open, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. You could tell it hadn't been touched in years, maybe longer. Broken stone paths led to nowhere, and old statues, now little more than weathered forms, stood in silence, their faces worn smooth. The garden had once been part of a home for children, an orphanage long since swallowed by fire. The blaze in 1932 had claimed the building and its inhabitants, children and nuns alike, all lost to the flames. The survivors had all but forgotten, the town barely ever speaking of it. But the garden seemed to remember. I spent the first day hacking at the overgrowth, my hands raw from the rough branches and brambles that fought back like old ghosts. By the time the sun had started to sink behind the trees, I had only made a small dent in the mess. I leaned on my rake, sweat dripping down my face, and took in a deep breath of the fading daylight. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of laughter. It was high-pitched, delicate, like the laugh of a child playing a game. I stood still, straining to hear, but the sound faded quickly, as if it had never existed. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe the whispering branches playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers started. Not words at first, just the soft rustling of something moving, something just beyond the edge of my hearing. But then it grew louder, clearer, until I could hear it distinctly, soft, lilting, as if it had been waiting for me to listen. Come play with us. My heart leapt in my chest. I froze, sitting up in my bed, listening to the silence that followed. The room was cold now, colder than it had been moments ago, and the air felt thick, almost as if it were holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, just a bad dream, just the wind moving through the cracks in the walls, but I couldn't shake the unease. It was then that I found it. A small tarnished locket, half buried under the roots of an ancient oak tree. The chain was darkened with age, the metal soft and brittle to the touch. I opened it, and there, behind the cracked glass, was a photo. A little girl, her face blurry with time, but her eyes stared out at me, wide and knowing. A laugh, light and joyful, bubbled up from the direction of the gate. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't eerie. It was the sound of children playing, as though they had never left, as though the garden had never been abandoned. And I knew then that they were still there, waiting. That night, I left the window open. It wasn't that I expected something. It wasn't that I thought the ghosts of children would come to visit, but a part of me hoped they would. And when the whispers came again, I didn't turn away. "Are you fixing our garden?" the voice asked, sweet and innocent. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. Yes, I whispered, I'm making it beautiful again. And from the darkness, the softest of whispers, a simple thank you. In the weeks that followed, the garden changed. The brambles started to retreat, yielding to the tender hands of time and care. Flowers, once thought dead, began to push through the soil. The children's laughter, faint but ever present, echoed through the quiet nights. I began to see them, shadows at the edge of my vision, flickering like candlelight in the dark. I never spoke to them. I never acknowledged them out loud. But they were there, watching, waiting. And one evening, as the sun sank low and stretched its golden fingers across the garden, I saw them, just for a moment. A handful of children, their faces soft and glowing in the fading light. They weren't solid, not in the way a person is solid, but their presence was undeniable. They smiled at me, their eyes full of wonder and something else, something like gratitude. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving only the sound of their laughter drifting on the wind. The garden was theirs once more, and I had become a part of it too. It was the winter of 1984 when I arrived in a town that barely existed on most maps, a place called Cold Hollow, tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains. I had been assigned to assist in the restoration of an old church, St. Elijah's they called it. But the locals had another name for it, the Weeping Chapel. It had been abandoned for decades, its wooden frame warped and rotting from time and neglect. The church sat on a lonely hill overlooking the town, and just below it a cemetery sprawled like a forgotten relic. The bell tower, long silent, loomed over the graves like a watchful sentinel. People avoided it, speaking of the place in hushed voices, as if the wrong words might stir something best left undisturbed. But it wasn't just the decay or the isolation that unnerved them. It was the voices. They said that if you stood outside the chapel at dusk, you could hear them, whispers, prayers, sobs. Some claimed it was the voices of those buried in the churchyard, pleading for something they could never have. Others swore it was something much worse. But I wasn't the kind to believe in ghost stories, at least not then. On my first evening there, as the sun bled into the mountains, I decided to stay behind after the work crew left. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of old pine and damp earth, and as the last of the daylight faded, I heard it. A whisper. Not the wind, not an animal. A voice. It called my name. I turned sharply, expecting to see one of the workers playing a joke, but I was alone. The pews inside were covered in dust, untouched for years. The altar stood bare except for a single candle, its wax melted into strange, unnatural shapes. The air smelled of burning incense, though no one had lit any. My chest tightened. I should have left. Any reasonable person would have. But something in me refused. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the whispers surged around me, urgent and desperate. The voices layered over each other, speaking in hurried tones. Some sobbing, some murmuring what sounded like prayers. One voice stood out among them, clearer than the rest. Por favor, ayúdanos. Help us. The desperation in those two words sent ice down my spine. I had always considered myself a practical man, a man of reason. But that was not the creaking of old wood, nor the groan of wind slipping through cracks in the walls. It was real. Someone, or something, was reaching out. I forced myself forward, my boots stirring the dust on the wooden floor. The whispers pressed against my skin, as if unseen hands were trying to grasp at me. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I refused to run. I had spent years comforting the grieving, easing the burdens of the living. But what about the dead? My eyes landed on the altar. The melted candle flickered, though there was no flame. The scent of incense grew thicker, almost suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to turn and flee, but I couldn't. I wasn't meant to run, I was meant to listen. I knelt before the altar, my fingers brushing against the carvings in the wood. Time had scarred it, but beneath the dust I could make out symbols, words etched deep into the grain. At the very center, a name. Isabel. I whispered it aloud, and the chapel exhaled. The air shifted, the whispers stilled. Then the woman's voice returned, clearer now. Padre, por favor. Father, please. A wave of sorrow crashed over me, so raw and consuming that I gasped. Isabel had stood here once, had pressed her hands to this very altar, had begged for something, someone, and she had never left. I had read about St. Elijah's dark past, the way women had come here seeking sanctuary in the late 1800s, accused of things they could never disprove. Witchcraft, sin, heresy. Some were taken by the townspeople, dragged to their deaths. Others simply vanished. Some said the church itself had condemned them. Others believed they had been swallowed by the land. But the truth was here within these walls, inside these voices. I bowed my head and whispered a prayer, not just for Isabel, but for all of them, for every soul still clinging to this place, bound to their suffering. My voice shook as I spoke the words of release, of peace. The chapel seemed to listen, and then silence. The air warmed, the sorrow lifted, like mist dissolving beneath the morning sun. I opened my eyes. The candle was gone. So was the scent of incense. The whispers had ceased. When I stepped outside, the town below was bathed in silver moonlight, distant and untouched by what had happened here. I turned back to the chapel, half expecting to see something in the doorway. But there was nothing. Just stillness. A place. Finally at peace. I left Cold Hollow a month later, but I knew I had not been alone that night. Some places remember, some places grieve, and some, if you listen closely enough, whisper their stories, hoping someone will finally hear. I arrived in Blackwater on a brittle November afternoon, the sky the color of an old bruise, the kind you forget is there until you press too hard. The town sat at the edge of nowhere, curled up like a dying thing, its buildings slumping under the weight of time. I was here because of a man named Father O'Rourke, an old mentor, a man whose voice had once been steady as iron, but who now on the phone had sounded like a whisper of himself. I need you, he had said. Something I started. I can't finish. He never begged, not once in all the years I'd known him, but the way his breath hitched, the way silence hung between us, told me this was close enough. The cemetery, Blackwater Rest, was a place spoken of in low voices, half drowned in whiskey and regret. People crossed the street rather than walk past it. They talked about shadows that moved when no one was there, about the way animals refused to go near the northernmost section. The heart of the legend, though, was a grave. No name, no dates, just one word carved into the stone so deeply the letters seemed to bleed into the earth. Forsaken. When I met O'Rourke at St. Jude's Rectory, I barely recognized him. He had always been a man of sharp angles, lean but never frail. Now he looked hollowed out, his skin stretched too thin, his eyes smudged with something beyond exhaustion. It's still there, he murmured. And so is he. He meant Father Elias, the last man who had tried to drive it out. Elias had gone to the grave decades ago armed with faith and fire, and had failed. They found him at dawn, curled at the base of forsaken stone, his fingers frozen in prayer, his lips cracked and split from words whispered too long. But his eyes, His eyes had been the worst. Wide open, pupils blown out, black pits staring into something none of us were meant to see. And his soul, gone. That night, I stepped through the iron gates, my breath a pale ghost in the frozen air. The silence was thick, pressing against me, a hush that felt unnatural, like the earth itself was waiting. The grave was easy to find. It was the only one that felt wrong. The ground slumped inward, soft beneath my feet, as if something beneath had been shifting, restless. The headstone glistened, wet with moss and age, but it wasn't the grave itself that made my gut twist. It was him. Father Elias, or what was left of him. His robes were shredded, hanging from his frame like the skin of something long dead. He was too thin, his face a hollowed-out mask, as if time had forgotten to carry him forward. His lips moved, soundless, his fingers twitching through the motions of a prayer. But his eyes, God help me, his eyes. They were bottomless pits where light had never belonged. I tightened my grip on the rosary in one hand, the flask of holy water in the other. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Father Elias. He stopped. His head twitched, his body stiff as if movement was foreign to him. When he spoke, his voice was layered as if it was not his alone. You should not have come. My stomach turned. The wind slithered through the trees, carrying a scent like damp rot. The earth exhaled, a long, fetid breath. Neither should you. A wet, rattling laugh bubbled up from his chest, and then the shadows began to move. A darkness slithered from the ground, creeping up his legs like a living thing, coiling around his arms, his throat. The thing inside him grinned. He won't let me go. The air turned thick, pressing in from all sides. The tombstones trembled, a deep groan rising from the ground itself. My fingers dug into the crucifix, nails biting into my palm. I didn't think. I acted. I raised the flask, flinging holy water in a wide arc. The droplets hissed where they struck, steam curling into the air like something alive. Elias, or the thing inside him, screamed. The sound ripped through the cemetery, a high, jagged wail that sent ice crawling down my spine. He belongs to me, it roared. The grave trembled beneath our feet. Dirt shifting, something stirring below. I forced my voice through the terror strangling my throat. He does not, I said, stepping forward. He is a servant of God. And you. I lifted the crucifix high, the silver catching the pale light. You are nothing but a parasite. The wind howled, carrying voices, rage, sorrow, desperation. Elias convulsed, his mouth opening in a silent scream, the darkness fighting, clawing, trying to hold on. But I wouldn't stop. By the authority of Christ, I bellowed, I command you, release him. The entity shrieked. The world seemed to crack, to shudder, and then silence. Elias crumpled to the earth, his body slack, the shadows dissipating like smoke in the wind. I stood there, breath ragged, waiting. And then, as the first fingers of dawn crept over the horizon, he began to fade. Not violently, not angrily, but peacefully, as if he was finally being allowed to move on. Just before he disappeared, his lips moved one last time. Thank you. And when I turned back to the grave, the name was gone. The stone was blank. I left Blackwater that morning. O'Rourke never asked for details, and I never gave them. Some things are better left unsaid, but sometimes in the dark of night I wonder, when I die, will I see Elias again, or will I see the thing that tried to keep him? I arrived in Grayson's Hollow just as autumn began to gnaw at the edges of summer, turning the leaves brittle and the air sharp with the scent of distant bonfires. It was a town where the past pressed in from all sides, whispering through the cracks in the pavement and the warped wood of abandoned storefronts. My assignment was at St. Elias Parish, A modest church crouched at the end of a long, forgotten road, its stones worn smooth by time and the quiet prayers of the faithful. Behind the church lay a walled-off garden, tangled with brambles and years of neglect. The wrought-iron gate groaned when pushed, as though resentful of intrusion. The space had once been part of an orphanage, long since reduced to little more than blackened foundations and whispers in the wind. In 1911, a fire had swallowed the building whole, taking with it 24 children and the nuns who cared for them. There was a memorial plaque, tarnished and half hidden by ivy, but no one visited. Not anymore. The townsfolk spoke of strange happenings. Laughter where there was no one, shadows that stretched just a little too far at dusk. I had been there less than a week when I first heard them. A laugh, light and sweet, the kind a child makes when they think they've won a game of hide and seek. It drifted from beyond the gate as I passed, curling around me like a stray wisp of fog. I turned quickly, my pulse suddenly thick in my ears. But the garden was empty save for the wind stirring the long grass. Determined to reclaim the space, I took it upon myself to clear the overgrowth. I spent hours hacking through thorny vines and pulling away roots that clung to the earth like grasping fingers. And that's when I began to find them, the relics of small lives once lived. A doll with a face split by a jagged crack, its glass eyes clouded with age. A wooden train car, its paint faded to the memory of color. A shoe, impossibly small, its laces fused together with soot and time. That night, the whispers started. Not words at first, just the soft rustling of something unseen shifting just beyond the periphery of my hearing. But as the hours stretched on, the sounds became clearer. A voice, delicate as paper, threading through the silence. "Come play with us, Father." My breath hitched. The room, warm moments before, grew cold, the kind of chill that settled deep in the bones. I sat up in bed, every nerve stretched tight as a bowstring. The church had always felt safe, hallowed ground, an island against the darkness of the world. But in that moment, it felt watched. I told myself it was exhaustion, an overactive imagination fueled by old stories and too little sleep. But the next day, as I pushed deeper into the garden, I unearthed something that made my blood run slow and thick. Beneath the roots of a sprawling oak, I found a child's locket, its silver chain blackened with age. When I pried it open, the hinge groaned in protest. Inside, behind a cracked pane of glass, was a photograph of a little girl. Her face was smudged with time, but her eyes burned bright. A gust of wind rattled the leaves overhead, carrying with it a sound that made my skin pebble with cold. Laughter, not cruel, not eerie, but bright and joyful, as if the children had never left, as if they had simply been waiting. That night I left my window open, not because I expected anything, but because some part of me wanted to believe. And when the whispers came again, I did not turn away. "Are you fixing our garden, Father?" I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw, my pulse like the wings of a trapped bird. Still I answered, "Yes, I want to make it beautiful again." A pause then, just as I began to drift into uneasy sleep. A whisper, barely there. Over the next few weeks, I poured myself into the work. The brambles gave way to soft earth, and wildflowers began to bloom in hesitant clusters. Parishioners started to take notice, some stopping to lend a hand, others watching from a careful distance, wary of what they could not explain. The garden, once a place of ruin, began to hum with life again. And then, One evening, as the last embers of sunlight stretched long shadows across the garden, I saw them, not fully, not as one sees a living person, but as one glimpses movement in a mirror just before turning away. A handful of children, their faces soft and smiling, their forms flickering at the edges like candlelight. I did not speak. I did not need to. Instead, I simply watched as they lingered in the growing dusk, their eyes wide with something like wonder. And then, in a breath of wind, they were gone. But the laughter remained, weaving through the air like an old song remembered. The garden was theirs once more,